Hello, thank you for joining us. With COP27 taking place on the African continent in Egypt wrapping up and the much anticipated U.S. Africa Leaders Summit on the horizon, I'm pleased to kick off the first several around the 2022 summit conversations that the Africa Center will be bringing to you in the coming weeks. We are thrilled today to be joined by Alice Albright, the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation in our studios of Washington, D.C. The MCC is an organization that deserves to be better known, given its large and relevant portfolio on the African continent. Global Partnership for Education, Exim Bank, Gavi, G7, your career, Mrs. Albright, led you to the highest position. The MCC's singular mission is to reduce poverty today through economic growth, as promoting inclusive and sustainable economic growth is a key part of the U.S. government's effort to build a stronger and more resilient global community, to promote good governance and democratic values, and create new markets and opportunities for the private sector. More than 70% of the MCC's portfolio is in Africa, translating to approximately $3.1 billion in active grant programs. Joining me in this conversation is our senior fellow, Abdul Salam Bello, who is the new Executive Director of Africa Group 2 at the World Bank, representing 23 African nations. Congratulations, dear Abdul, but today you will speak as Africa Center Senior Fellow. Beyond Alice Albright here, we are honored to be joined by the Honorable Romuald Wadani, Minister of Economy and Finance for the Republic of Benin. Mr. Minister, thank you for joining us. You are one of the rising figures of the continental African scene, and you were in Washington a few months ago to attend the World Bank IMF meetings. As opening remarks, may I ask you to tell us about the situation of your country and your expectation from the development organizations, and particularly the American, through the MCC. You can add, of course, a question to Mrs. Albright at the end of your speech in order to start the dialogue with her. Over to you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I would like to start with maybe saying a couple of words on the nature and the quality of the cooperation between Benin and the MCC before coming to Benin and the situation in Benin. You mentioned the size of grant that the MCC is providing to poor countries and developing countries, but I do believe that people are not aware of the significant impact of that contribution is bringing to our countries. So I would like to start with a couple of minutes dedicated to showing how this type of cooperation is changing the day-to-day life of people in the country. And then, of course, I will come back to Benin and provide a couple of information on how Benin is doing, given the global situation we all know today. So starting with the nature and the quality of relations with MCC, Benin is now completing the second program with MCC. We have completed the first one that started in 2004, and then we are now completing the MCC program number 2 that's starting in 2017. What is very interesting about the cooperation between MCC and our country in general, and specifically Benin, is not only the grant we're getting from MCC is allowing us to reduce significant infrastructure gap we're having, but that cooperation is coming with a framework of reform that allow to make sure that the impact of those investments for our population, those impacts are both inclusive and sustainable. I would like to give the example of the current compact. The current compact we're working on with MCC in Benin is for about 391 million, almost 400 million, fully dedicated to the energy sector. When I was appointed Minister of Finance in 2016, Benin was importing 100% of our energy. Today, thanks of that program and also the additional contribution from the government of Benin, we're able to produce close to 70% of our needs, electricity needs. So the grants we got from MCC in 2017 now allow about 10 million of people in Benin to have access to energy, and mostly green energy, solar energy and green energy. So grants helping us to reduce the gap of energy infrastructure we have. But also what I want to mention here, and that's something very unique about the cooperation with MCC, is the cooperation came with a framework of reform. Our national electricity company, we call here SBE, before the program, for 20 years and more than 20 years was a loss-making machine, was losing money. But thanks to the reform and the framework of reform we had put on the table, and we got funding to finance through the grant. Now, since 3 years now, the company is making money. The fact that the company is not making money helped the company to produce the capacity, the cash flow that will help the country to generate more investment and to bring more electricity to more people. That's bringing the sustainability of the investment part I was talking about. So you see how like a program like that can impact more than 10 million people. And right now in many rural areas, you have youth, you have women who are now able, thanks to that electricity that they have, to start small businesses, transformation of agricultural product, et cetera, things that were not possible like 3-4 years ago. So that's why I wanted to take that example to say that the MCC model is something very important because it's doing 3 things. One, bringing grant for significant investment to reduce the gap in key sectors. Secondly, improving the governance of the sectors. The MCC program number 1 we had was on access to justice and financial inclusion. So that comes with a couple of laws and reform that we did like about 10 years ago. And now in the electricity sectors, also the new reform that we put in place thanks to that grant is allowing us to make the sector profitable and sustainable and capable to bring electricity to everybody in the country by 2027-28. And the third one is we're getting some expertise thanks to that grant. So we are able now to train our local people. So people now, they are mixed with people coming from Canada and many other countries that are bringing expertise and another way to manage electricity utilities company. So we have people that are better trained, we have better governance, and we have a significant reduction of investment gap. So that's example of cooperation. I think we should make more communication about it so that other institutions can use it and see, Africa does not only need money, but we need that money to come with like a package. Human capital development, training people, making sure that people who are getting the US taxpayers' money are doing reform for a better governance, and making sure that the key infrastructure gap are closed. We are now working on a new program, which is a very interesting one. The third program that we hope to sign next month in Washington, DC, is dedicated to improving economic integration between Benin. It's a regional compact between Niger, Benin, and then the MCC. And that program will allow us, to improve economic integration and regional trade and cross-border cooperation between Niger and Benin. Niger does not have access to the sea, so they use the port of Cotonou as a port for the country. But the road between the two countries, which is about 700 kilometers, is just a chaos. It's not usable for trucks. So thanks to that new program that we're working on, and we hope to sign next month, will improve the connectivity between Niger and Benin, will improve cross-border transaction and trade. And it's very interesting because one of the takeaway we all learned from the COVID-19 crisis is Africa does not trade with Africa. Like, for example, in West Africa, the trade within West Africa is less than 12%. We trade with outside of the region. And one of the reasons why we are not trading within us is due to the lack of infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure. So now with the new program we're working on, we'll start addressing that challenge, which is how do we make sure that our countries, have more cross-border transaction, trade within themselves. With the COVID-19 crisis, products that could have been produced in Côte d'Ivoire were coming from China. And then with, the restriction of mobility, we were waiting for months before we can get product that we could receive from another country in the region. So that's also something very interesting because MCC is focusing on very key areas that are having a significant impact on the day-to-day life of our population. So I really want to thank MCC and special thank to Ms. Albright for that. Now coming to Benin. Yeah, Benin, we're lucky enough because Benin is now one of the most stable and performing economic in Africa. Last year, 2021, we had 7.2% growth rate. And this year, for 2022, the growth rate will be close again to 6.5 or 7% again. Thanks to the position we took in 2020, in 2020, many countries in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis were asking our partners, our donors, to cancel our debt. And then Benin stood and said, we don't need debt cancellation. We need to sit and see how we can actually find a better way to fund our economies, not asking people to cancel our debt. And we believe that thanks to that position, the global rating agencies, they actually confirmed and upgraded our position. And thanks to all the reform that we have been doing since 2016, now we are in a position where the country is having a very stable and very resilient economy. We have a very good and strong relationship with IMF. We just signed a new program in July this year, a very innovative program that was discussed during the annual meeting. Now, what I want to do going forward, Benin is facing not only the key challenges we all know. The Ukraine crisis, has brought for many countries two key things. One is global inflation, but in our region, we are now having food security issue because our cereal production and most of our agriculture production depend on fertilizers that are coming from Russia, Ukraine. So 90% of our fertilizer are coming from, East Europe. So with the war in Ukraine, we have like shortage of fertilizer, no access to fertilizer in many cases. So the agriculture production will go down. So there is a clear challenge to how we address the food security issue that may happen next year. So global inflation, food security issue, new challenges coming from the war in Ukraine. But in addition to the consequences of that Ukraine war, we are seeing since the last couple of 6-7 months now, the acceleration of other challenges that we all knew about. One being climate change, and second one being security issue. Coming to climate change, this year we have...
Minister Wadani, I think you are going to shorten your speech because...
okay, sorry.
This is Albright event,
So let me finish on that. So based on that thing, maybe to finish on saying that...
Thank you.
The war in Ukraine, we had the consequences, but now in the region, most of the countries are facing two things, climate change. Benin, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, we are facing like significant flooding. So climate change is a real reality. We're facing that right now in our country. So it's a key challenge. And second thing is security issue. We have seen in Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso now, some coup d'etat and many things that are creating acceleration and deterioration of security issues. So the key thing is, how do we make sure that we keep the track of our investment and our reform to make sure that we keep reducing poverty while we're finding means to address those new challenges? Maybe that's my question to Mrs. Albright, is how MCC can help us to better address those new challenges. Thank you, and sorry for being so long.
No, thank you, Minister Wadani. It was a brilliant explanation, and you laid out the situation very well, and we are very happy of this great start for this important conversation that highlights very well MCC's accomplishment for your country, Benin. So I'm happy to give her the floor and to answer or have a reaction to your speech. Thank you very much, Minister. Mrs. Albright.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a great honor to be here with all of you at the Atlantic Council. This is my first event that I've ever done here, so it's a very special moment. And Minister Wadani, you just did a fantastic job outlining how MCC works. So thank you so much for those very kind words. It has been a great honor for my agency to work with your country, you and your colleagues. And we're very much looking forward to signing the next arrangement, which, as you described, is focused on the flow of goods from Niger down to through your country to the port of Cotonou. Let me zero in on, I think, your last point, which is the point about climate. And we've all just, I was in COP in Sharm el-Sheikh last week. I know many people online are either still there or also just recently come back. So let me just share some big picture impressions about it. First of all, huge thanks to the Egyptian government for hosting everybody. That is by no means an easy feat to have so many visitors from all around the world coming to Sharm el-Sheikh. It was a terrific set of events. It was also a great moment of pride for myself and my agency to be joined by so many others from the U.S. government to really show how committed the U.S. government is to the whole climate agenda right now. So the U.S. government is back in the Paris Accords, and of course the President on the Friday announced a whole range of different types of interventions and things that are going to be undertaken to do our part to help the climate agenda, and I think it's very fair to say that the administration is very, very committed. There's clearly a significant sense of urgency coming out of COP about the many different aspects of the climate crisis, whether or not it's mitigation, adaptation. There's a significant focus on what we call a just energy transition, which is really understanding the equity issues associated with the climate crisis, and also how unevenly the climate crisis is hitting the many, many countries that are facing it. One of the things that was particularly on the minds of us from MCC is what I'll call sort of the financial dimension. If you were to line up all the countries in the world and how they're being impacted by climate, money is going to the top part of the list, from the private sector, from the multilateral development banks, from various places, to try to provide investments to spur innovation to deal with the different aspects of climate change. It's the bottom part of the list that is not getting the money that it needs to, and in many ways they are the most severely impacted by the many aspects of climate. So one of the things that my agency did, MCC, along with our friends at USAID, was you introduced an endeavor called Climate Finance Plus, where we're going to explore how can we use the resources that we have to try to encourage more private investment to come into the countries that aren't getting the financing and resources that they need. So I think that one of the key takeaways from this COP was it's all about finance. So we will do our part as MCC, working with USAID, to focus on the finance piece. So that's sort of a roundabout answer to your question, Minister, about climate, but I think that it's something that will also come up during the African Leaders Summit in December. But my agency is very, very focused on it, along with all the other things that we work on. But we know it's something that is of great interest to our country partners, and that's how we work. We work very closely with our country partners on the things that are important to them, and we know the climate is one of them. So expect to see some real focus, particularly on the resilience end of the equation.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Albright. Minister Wadani, thank you. We really hope to see you in Washington and to dedicate you an entire event at the Atlantic Council. I hope you will accept. We'll be very proud and happy to have you more because you develop a powerful thought on and vision about your country and more than that, the continent. So thank you very much for your participation today.
Invitation accepted. Thank you very much.
So we are waiting for you. Now I leave the floor to my colleague, Senior Fellow Abdul Salam Bello, for who resumed the conversation with Mrs. Albright.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Ambassador Rama. And thank you very much, Alice. Very good to have you here. I will not repeat everything that the Minister of Benin mentioned, but a couple of things came out very clearly. Issue of financing, strengthening the governance, developing expertise. Those are all the value addition you are bringing in addition to providing resources. So all those important components in your support, I think, are very important for those for African countries. But meanwhile, you mentioned in your response, you use a key word, equity, when it speaks to energy. And this brings me to your strategic plan that you call a DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So we'll be glad to have your perspective on those key four dimensions you have outlined in this strategic plan, and going forward also maybe giving us more flavor about the MCC identity, its value addition or its comparative advantage when we look at all the development agencies that are maybe in DC, but overall the world supporting Africa development agenda. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and it's wonderful to see you again. And congratulations, of course, on all the work that you're doing for many institutions.
Thank you.
A huge role. So let me, if I may, answer your second question first and your first question second, because I think it may make a bit more sense that way. So just a very short bit of information about MCC. MCC was created in 2004 by President Bush, and it was created to be a bit of a different approach and a different business model to international development relative to the other very important neighbors that we have throughout the U.S. government that also do international development. So we were created to be, on the one hand, a grant finance provider. So we provide grants only. And that's obviously certainly very important, particularly in the current day, the world of high inflation rates and high interest rates. So it's a very certain kind of money. We're very selective in how we work. Countries first have to be, at the moment, low income or lower middle income countries, using, of course, the World Bank classifications. And then countries we have what we call our scorecard, which evaluates countries on essentially three different types of policy areas. One is a country managing its economy well? A second is it investing in its people? So this is the amount of money that goes towards things like health and education. And the third is a country a democracy and trying to fight corruption? And the logic of that, and this is really the essence of why the agency was set up, is that U.S. taxpayer money should work alongside governments that are themselves trying to do the right thing for their citizens and be democracies. And that's why we are so selective with the countries that we work with. One of the very interesting parts of the selectivity is of all the 81 countries, we score all of them every year, and every scorecard is on our website. So countries have a very clear, and all the data for all the scoring comes from third parties. So countries have access to all that data, and they can see exactly where they stand in terms of progress against all the different indicators. And many countries who know they're not yet eligible spend a lot of time trying to adopt some of the reforms that would be necessary in order to become eligible. So there's a big incentivizing impact for that. Since we were started in 2004, we've worked with 49 countries. We've deployed $15 billion across a whole range of sectors, which I'll get to. It's really the basics. There's health, education, energy, agriculture, transportation. It's a variety of different things. Climate resiliency, and it's really at the behest of what countries themselves consider to be their key constraints to growth. And we estimate, and we're very proud of this, that we've helped as many as 215 million people benefit from our programs in some way or another. So while we are a relatively small part of the U.S. government, we're something that has significant reach and significant impact. So that just gives you a flavor of who we are and what we do. We have looked at equity and inclusion and diversity both on an internally facing basis for the agency as well as on an externally facing basis in terms of our work. In terms of as an internally facing basis, and this particularly comes out of some of the very tragic events in the last few years in our country, we have renewed our commitment to make sure that we are being as diverse and inclusive and equitable and providing access as we can. And we've appointed now just about a year ago a chief diversity officer, and we have a range of programs internally to make sure that we are doing the very best we can. And it's the right thing to do, and there's a lot of energy and attention paid on that internally. And we have a long way to go, but it's something that we're very committed to. Externally, we know, and everybody who's in the international development world knows, that if we leave marginalized communities out of the international development and the economic growth sort of endeavor, if we leave women out, if we leave people who are ethnic minorities, people who live very far away, if we leave all of those people out, countries are not going to have the chances to progress in the way that they need to. So we're very focused on how, in our case, gender and inclusion figures into our programmatic work. And the two words that I've asked my team to keep sort of front of mind is routine and systematic. So we've adopted with our gender and inclusion work a commitment that we're going to routinely and systematically look at how different communities are included into the development endeavor in countries. And we try to make sure that we're working with countries, programming that into our work. And I expect that we'll be doing more and more of that as we think about how equity and inclusion figures into a just energy transition, because it all in some ways comes together. So it's a long answer to a good question. I appreciate your patience in letting me go around and around in circles a little bit.
No, we'll have some follow-up for you.
Good.
Thank you very much. Allow me just to, Mrs. Albright, to say to our audience that I want to remind you all we can have at the end of this conversation a QA session. So submit your questions in the Zoom QA section. So we'll come back to the audience later. I just would like to react to what you just said, Mrs. Albright. Low-income countries and stress the comments made by Minister Wadani earlier around the idea of trade, the importance of trade between countries. And I have the feeling that we are at the crossroads, or the U.S. Africa relations are at the crossroads with the expiration of AGOA and the building of this continental free trade area. So my question is how MCC is preparing itself to this revolution in terms of trade. Does this these changes, tremendous changes, will impact your work and the way you fulfill your missions in these countries, low-income countries?
The answer is yes. We will be very much involved. We received in 2018, and it was part of, I believe legislatively, it was part of a change that was associated with a change in AGOA. We received the authorization to do what we call regional compacts. And the compact that the minister referred to between Benin and Niger is the first one that we've been able to do. And the essential logic of the regional authority is to look at where there are opportunities to work regionally and see if we can't make some progress by doing so. Now, for us, it's complicated. Any country that is involved in a regional compact has to itself be eligible to work for MCC, and then the projects then also have to meet all of our sort of economic criteria. So it's very difficult to achieve all of that. So Benin, the upcoming arrangement between Benin and Niger is the first one that we will be doing, and we're very enthusiastic about it. We have another one that is sort of in process, that is the West Africa Power Pool, that is currently involving Cote d'Ivoire.
Yes.
And we're sort of in an exploration phase about where does that one go? That's earlier stage, but something that I believe holds a lot of promise given the importance of lowering energy prices in the region. Undoubtedly, there are hopefully some important climate impacts from that as well, but I can imagine, given the potential scope of the West Africa power pool arrangement, that it also could be quite meaningful for the region. We are in this time of the year is when we make selections for our new round of countries that we'll be working on, so I can't, I would be making a mistake if I shared what's sort of possible there, but we were going to continue to look at where we can meaningfully make a difference regionally, and I think what's exciting about it is if you think about some of the, so think about three major challenges that many parts of the globe faces right now: food security, pandemic preparedness, and energy. All three of them in one way or another could benefit from a regional approach as opposed to a country-by-country approach. So it's an authority that I think is very important for MCC. We're going to try and lean in and use it as much as we can. And I won't get into the ins and outs of AGOA, but hopefully it will be an important complement from the U.S. government alongside of what we see with AGOA and many of the other things that the U.S. government is doing.
Thank you very much. Abdul?
Yes, a couple of follow-up. Food security, pandemic, energy. I want to get back to the energy side, and I really like what you presented on the regional dimension linked to energy, West Africa power pool. I think coming from the region, we believe that you maximize impact by going through the regional approach. You can really have economics of scale, mobilize additional resources, and deliver on the impact. But I want to link this discussion with also on the COP, on the climate agenda. How do you see the role of MCC in supporting increasing the access to energy in Africa, but taking into account the climate agenda that we've been discussing about? And you mentioned one important thing is just energy transition. Right. So how do you think in the dialogue you have with various countries, mobilization of financing, especially concessional financing, to help increase access to energy through renewables going forward, knowing that if you take the Africa continent, you have 600 million people who do not have access to energy, which is a huge, almost twice the size of the United States in terms of population. So how do you see the role of MCC, partnership, resource mobilization, policy support, regional approach? What's your take on that?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about what we are doing generally speaking, and then how it applies. Yes. So our work in the climate area tends to focus on the resilience side of the equation. And so we will help, a country will come to us as we're working and saying, you know, we have a particular problem with this matter, and then we'll work with them on that basis. So a terrific example of that involves Niger, where we've been working very closely with them to help them mobilize the water resources that have been discovered under the ground in Niger, which was
cool, because Abdul is from Niger. I'm just saying.
So you know that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I heard about it.
Okay, so you know about it, and we were with Mr. Betty last week in COP, who had an opportunity to explain it. So that's an example where I'm speaking under your control. So
no, not at all. Feel free.
From the country, but the country, of course, had encountered drought conditions in many areas, which is we all know is a function of climate and climate change. And in working with your countrymen, we've been able to discover underground aquifers that, and I think this might have been a surprise to a lot of people, it was to us, I think, a significant amount of underground water. And we're now working closely with your countrymen to deploy the water and get it distributed. So that's an example of climate resilience. And there's many, many other examples like that. So we'll probably be more in the transmission, distribution, resilience end of the equation. And depending on what countries identify as being key concerns of theirs, we will engage accordingly. Another country that we're working very closely with right now is Lesotho. They too are facing food security and agricultural what I'll call sort of insufficiency issues, and we're working, we've just signed another compact with them earlier this year to help scale up their horticulture business, which will help with agriculture, which is also sort of a function of drought and food security issues. So those are just a couple of examples. We're also working with Zambia on a range of issues that are ultimately food security related. I think what we see in our work is that food security and climate change and energy are all very related to each other. So our agenda would not be, we're going to help you work on climate change itself. What we will work on is those aspects of a country, according to what they believe their concerns are, that are being impacted by climate change. So a common theme that we'll see throughout our work is agriculture, transportation, energy sufficiency, and drought resilience for agriculture. Those are probably common themes. We also spend a lot of time on issues to do with water. And so previously we've helped build a water and drainage whole system for a significant chunk of Lusaka. Although it's outside of the continent, we've just signed a huge compact with Mongolia because their access to water in Ulaanbaatar has been very negatively impacted by climate. So we've helped mobilize a whole system that will help provide better water. We've also just provided over $400 million to East Timor, who also have significant water challenges, which is in part related to climate. So we work on the sort of the what is being impacted end of the equation, I would say, which is slightly different from sort of the energy generation part of the equation.
Thank you, Mrs. Albright. When I listen to you explaining your vision and describing some situations on the ground, I'm curious to know what countries in Africa have you visited? We know that earlier you have been in Lesotho, I think. And what strikes you the most in African needs on the ground? You mentioned the importance of resilience, which means the reactions of the populations. So what strikes you the most when you visit African countries, and where the most important needs are, and what should be improved, according to you, in the multilateral policies to these populations?
That's a huge question. Let me try to summarize that.
Excellent question.
It is an excellent question. First of all, let me start by saying that our business model is very defined, and we're very committed to the concept of country ownership. So it would be highly unusual, if not would not happen, for either myself or my staff to travel to a country and visit with country partners and say, you must do this. Wouldn't happen. Once a country becomes eligible, we start in with a whole process of what we call key constraints to growth. And that is working very closely with countries to do a lot of economic analysis that identifies what are the major obstacles that the country sees to their growth. So it's a very intentional process that is to put the priorities of the countries first. We then have a whole sort of operational platform that sets up various entities, such as the countries working with those entities, that actually does a lot of the implementation work. Now, I joined the agency in February. I've thus far traveled to Lesotho, Zambia, Morocco, and let me think what else. Well, Mozambique, Kenya, Cabo Verde.
A lot of countries. Yeah.
I've been to several outside. Over my career and other jobs, I've been all over the place, but I still have places to go, CC. And what I think there's some common themes, let's say. There's some common themes. Clearly, there are financial pressures, and the world is feeling the impact of inflation, of high interest rates, of too much debt. And I've also been to Kenya. I forgot to mention Kenya. Too much debt. And so that's something that is going to have to be resolved. The countries that I have visited are feeling a significant impact from different aspects of climate, whether or not it's not having enough energy, having too much water, not enough water, agricultural insufficiency, difficulty getting goods to market. How do you scale small holder farms into a much more robust agricultural system so that countries don't have to import food, which is too expensive and is hard to accommodate in the fiscal environment that we're in. So there's a lot of different and connected impacts from climate. The other thing that we hear over and over again is the question of whether or not human capital in countries is really acquiring the right skills and the right capabilities for the jobs of the 21st century. And also very lingering vulnerabilities from the health impact. I think people everywhere have learned how vulnerable health systems are due to the pandemic and how quickly that kind of took over our lives. So in addition to needing to focus on a number of hard infrastructure areas which are suffering because of climate, there's a human capital infrastructure piece that needs to be invested in as well. And so we need to figure out how we balance those things. Because the progress, in my very humble opinion, is going to require both. It's going to require the human capital infrastructure as well as the hard infrastructure. On the question of concessionality, I am very proud of the fact that my agency is a purely concessional organization, and it's an incredibly important type of money right now, and we are doing our level best to use the resources that have been kindly bestowed on us by the U.S. taxpayer in the very best way that we can. And I consider one of my jobs is to go advocate as much as I can to get as much resource as we can, because I think the nature of our tool is so important. So the concessionality piece really, really matters, and I think that we occupy a very particular, because we are purely concessional, we occupy a very special place in the overall sort of international development landscape in terms of different types of financial tools that are available at the moment.
Another value added. Abdul, would you like to ask a last question?
The last one? Or?
Last one, because after that, maybe we can take a few questions from our audience.
Okay. No, I think it's a very good discussion we're having here. Maybe in terms of perspective, Ambassador Ramayad, in her opening remarks, she mentioned the Africa Leaders Summit that is coming in December 13-15. So the Atlantic Council also is partnering with the White House, the State Department in those events. In your remark, you mentioned also the inclusion, the youth, the job. How do you see among the outcomes of this summit, the response of the U.S. government, maybe MCC, I will say, on the agenda related to youth, inclusion, and jobs, especially looking at the size of the Africa population, the magnitude of the youth, and the number of young people who are coming every year on the job market? How do you see the U.S. potential role from this summit, what's going forward?
And if you allow me, Abdul, to add something, an additional question, what will be your role as an agency in this upcoming U.S. Africa Leaders Summit?
Well, first of all, we're very excited about the summit, and I think that the administration is very, very intent on building strong relationships with all of our partners on the continent. It's an incredibly important part of the world for the U.S. You can see that by the comments that have been made by President Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Blinken, and many, many others. So we are very, very enthusiastic about all the visitors that we're about to get, and very honored that at an incredibly busy time, everyone's coming. My agency is, we're gearing up. We've been meeting about it already. We expect to have lots of visitors, whether or not we're part of events or having bilaterals. And for us, we're a pretty small agency, but for us, this is a big deal. And we're all very, very much looking forward to it. To answer your question about youth and the agenda there, I think it's important when we think about our overall set of relationships with the continent to understand how varied it is. I mean, on the one hand, this conversation needs to be about trade, about money from many different aspects of money, about bringing in the private sector, about concessionality, about what the U.S. can do to help reform the multilateral development banks. It's a wide conversation. At the same time, we have to remember, I think it was last week, that the population in the world crossed 8 billion people.
Yes.
And if you look at the demographics of different countries, and your country is a very good example of this. I remember meeting with your Minister of Education in my last job, and he reminded me that the size of your country doubles every 18 years.
Yes, absolutely.
And so what that means is that the population growth rate is high, but it also means that the number of people that are part of your population that are young is very high. And so we are sitting on a situation globally where more and more people are being born. They are not getting access to the right opportunities. And that is going to lead to more and more lack of hope for what the future is. So all of us have a responsibility to think about how can we help that problem. It's health, it's education, it's energy, it's getting all the right money in the right places. It is a huge agenda. And no one agency is going to fix that problem alone. But we have to think about what does the future look like and how can all of the different, this is what I speak from the perspective of MCC, what can we do in our way, in our swim lane, to make a difference here? And that's why my team and I are leaning in absolutely as much as we can to try to make the most of the tools that we have, work with our neighbors in the U.S. government. This is the DFC, USAID, U.S. Trade and Development Agency, everyone else, because it is an enormous agenda. It's not just about climate. It's not just about infrastructure. It's not just about money, because the people who need to be served are the youth who are going to wind up inheriting all of these challenges. So we are absolutely thrilled that all of our friends from the continent are coming in December. It's going to be a very busy 3 days, but we could not be more excited about it. And it'll be, as I say, we're a small but very proud agency, and we could not be more excited about everybody coming.
So Africa is coming to Washington mid-December. I have an additional question. Will President Biden travel to Africa? We remember his predecessor never visited Africa in 4 years, and that is the question everything is asking. Will Joe Biden or VP Harris visit the African continent?
Well, it's not really in my swim lane to know the answer to that question, and I want to be very disciplined about my swim lane. Of course, President Biden was just in COP in Egypt, and I know was very excited about being there. I hope they find an opportunity to go, but I know that they are both very concerned about what is going on the continent, and they want to rebuild our relationships across the continent. And I know that's very important to everybody who's involved in the U.S. government, and I know that for certain. So I know they're both very much looking forward to everybody visiting in mid-December.
Senegal, for example, just an example.
Well, I'll keep that in mind.
Transmit the message. Okay, thank you. And talking about global powers, I would like to tell you to pick a question. It is the first on my screen from the audience. Mr. Cohen, Ambassador Cohen, retired. He's asking, has the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative improved connections among West African nations? This question was expected when it comes to Africa. China is right there, and many people who comment the U.S. policy to Africa mention the Chinese competition. So what is your view about Chinese role on the African continent?
Well, China has certainly provided a lot of financing, and that's very clear when the countries that we meet with talk about the different financing choices that they have. Let me comment, though, on the business model that my agency has and sort of the the contrast that it presents relative to some of the types of financing coming out of China. First of all, I think we have to understand that countries have choices, but they are all, to varying extents, in difficult financial circumstances. So countries do have choices to make about where they will secure funding. I think there are a few very distinctive differences that MCC has. First of all, we are a provider of grants, not loans, and money does not need to be repaid. I think that's a very significant advantage right now. We also work very much behind the priorities of countries and let countries make their own decisions about what's important to them, and then we work very closely with them about how to execute against those priorities. So it's in a very, very transparent way. The third part, and I touched on this earlier, is about the pathway the governments are on. Governments that become eligible for MCC financing have decided to be democracies. They're very committed to that. They've decided to invest in their people. They've decided to be open and transparent and deliver for their citizens. This is about democracies delivering. And so it presents, and it's something that aligns very much with U.S. values, and it aligns very much with what U.S. taxpayers' expectations are for our agency. And so it presents a very different picture from some of the types of other financing practices that we see coming out of China. I can't answer your question about the degree of connectivity because I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but I know that we're trying to do our level best to really make a difference in the countries that we work with.
Thank you very much. Another question by Soda Low. She's asking with the on climate change, which is an important concern for people who watch, when the adverse effects of climate change largely being seen in the African continent, especially in the West African region, we can expect to see an increase in climate refugees in the coming years. How can the global community and organizations like MCC prepare for that level of displacement? A few days ago, we welcomed here at your place the Executive Secretary of UNCCD, Ibrahim Chow, and he said that the concept of climate refugees is not accepted in everywhere by everyone. But what is your opinion about that, knowing that the concept of resilience is at the heart of this phenomenon?
My personal view is that the concept of climate refugees is very real. And you can just look at across the map and see where climate displacement is the most sort of prevalent and see where people are moving. So I think it's quite real. And I can't comment on whether or not all the different UN conventions and so forth have recognized that, but at some point they probably will. Mm-hmm. I think that it does, and you touched on it, it does raise on the topic of resilience. And I think that as we think about the main international development challenges going forward, we have to look at with our country partners, how are countries resilient to be able to contend with the impacts of climate change. So are agriculture systems capable? Mm-hmm. Are water systems capable? Are education and health systems capable? Is transportation and port structures capable of dealing with the changes? So I think one of the things that's very meaningful about the way that my agency works is it does work on the sufficiency of systems. And so that's going to wind up being, I think, an important tool in the toolkit against the whole question of resiliency in terms of the sort of emergency response piece of handling different types of refugees and internally displaced people. That's probably more in the mandate of USAID. It's not really in our mandate. We would more work on sort of the systems piece of it.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Albright. I think it's time to end unfortunately, our conversation. Very exciting conversation from infrastructure to resilience, connectivity to inclusion. I think with my colleague Abdul Salam Bello, we have covered a lot of topics, which shows how MCC is busy in many sectors of the African nations. So thank you, Mrs. Albright. You have inaugurated our series around the 2022 summit. during the next week. Next week's the Africa Center will host many events around this very important, critically important summit that will stress the state of the relations between the United States and the African nations. So we were very happy to have you with us. And we hope that you had the opportunity to lay out your vision and your priorities.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's wonderful that you all are kicking off this series in the run-up to the African Leaders Summit. I mean, it's going to be one of the major events of our calendar here in Washington, and the fact that you're doing this is just terrific. So congratulations, and I know that you all will play an important role in sort of building the dialogue around the summit, and I hope we can reconnect afterwards. So thank you so much for having us.
We hope so. Thank you, Mrs. Albright, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you very much.